Welcome to this special dialogue with Professor Nasr, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and one of the keenest observers of the region. Thank you, Professor. Thanks, Vali, for being with us today, for being with us in this event, which is part of the year-long initiative towards the 9th edition of Rome Med, which ISPI co-promotes with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Vali, you have written extensively on the Shia-Sunni Shiism and the sectarian competition in the Middle East. In recent times, these fractures seem to have somehow lost its predominance. Would you agree, or do you think these splits are bound to play again a prominent role?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It's wonderful to be back with ISPI and Med again. You're absolutely right. These issues are not front of mind in the sense that we don't have ongoing conflicts that revolve around the Shia-Sunni issue since the defeat of ISIS. But these issues are very much there, largely because we do have countries in the region that have a sectarian mix, countries like Yemen, Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, in which the division of power is along communal lines. So even though there is no live political contestation like the way we saw during the Arab Spring, that does not mean that these issues are not there. Secondly, the issue of Iran's role in the region is still very prominent and front of mind for its Arab neighbors. And in that issue, even though Iran does not specifically talk about the Shia issue, but all of its clients in the region, in other words, the forces that Arab governments object to, from Hezbollah to militias in Syria, to the PMF in Iraq, to Houthis in Yemen, all are connected to Iran, both geostrategically, but also because of the identity of faith. So we could think that the sectarian dynamic that we saw between 2003 and, let's say, 2015, from the war in Iraq to the end of ISIS, has entered a different phase. Now, we don't have live conflict in the way that we did, but it's part of the region's geostrategy. It's very much part of the competition between Saudi Arabia and its allies and Iran and its allies, for instance.
Let's stay on Iran, but let's move on the domestic front. You have recently written that months of protests in the country have made the regime even more aggressive than before. So what's next? What do you think is the most likely scenario on this?
Well, there are a number of issues at play. In other words, there is still tremendous amount of popular discontent and anger within Iran itself, although it was not able to translate protest into a mass mobilization movement that would seriously threaten the regime like the way it did in Egypt, say, in 2010, 2011. But that's very much there. And economic pressure on Iran is quite severe. The currency has collapsed pretty much, and the United States is keeping up that economic pressure on Iran. And with Iran's nuclear issue, with its role in Ukraine very much on play, Europe and the United States are tightening that economic noose. So that's very much there. But the expectation that those who are in charge of Iran, the revolutionary guards, people around the supreme leader, were quickly going to compromise with protesters, and we would have a sort of a transition to something different, was probably wishful thinking. In other words, the way that the regime in Iran interpreted the challenge was pretty much like the way Assad interpreted the challenge when people demanded democracy and open government in Syria. You know, they saw it as a foreign ploy, they saw it as regime threatening, and they believed that you have to first crush the rebellion by whatever means, and then you can think about how you're going to address things. For instance, as we are speaking, the government has released a number of political prisoners that perhaps signals the fact that they're feeling a bit more confident than they did a number of months ago. But I think the most decisive things about Iran, now that we go forward, are really external, largely because its nuclear program is unresolved. The JCPOA may be, quote unquote, in coma, deep coma, but Iran, according to IAEA, now has enough enriched material for several bombs. We're approaching deadlines in October at the United Nations that could trigger snapback sanctions on Iran that then may provoke Iranian reaction. And we're seeing Iran, because its relationship with Europe and the United States is going into deep freeze. And I think because the role of Europe over the past 5 months with Iran during the protests has changed from being a go-between between the United States and Iran to essentially being the one that is actually maybe pushing the relationship much more in the direction of confrontation, that the Iranians are basically doubling down on the relationship with Russia. And the people who wanted all along for Iran to forget about the West and rely on Russia, I think, have the upper hand in Tehran. So I would say the regime is still facing the same kinds of troubles that it did in September. It still could be facing serious uprisings, but the people that are in charge in Iran are now more hardline. They're more pro-Russia, they're more suspicious of the West, and there are people who basically believe that the protests need to be crushed.
You addressed some of the issue I wanted to raise with the next question, but let me get to this anyhow, because as you mentioned, recent events have pushed Iran and Russia closer to one another. You mentioned the role Iran is playing in Ukraine, and you mentioned that the relation those who believe the relation with Russia could be stronger within Iran are getting in the front line. And how do you see Russia-Iran relation evolving in the next month or year to come?
I think it largely also depends on what happens in the Ukraine war. I mean, does Russia, do we see the Ukraine war continue in its current format for another year or two? Or that we see a significant defeat by Russia? Do we see Russia's calculations in its relationship with the West change? I mean, in the current climate, Russia needs Iran. Russia needs Iran desperately. And also Russia needs Iran not to have relations with Europe and the West, because the Russians don't want Iranian oil and gas flowing to Europe. And so there is, if you would, a great benefit for Russia in the collapse of Iran-European relations, and in the fact that there is no pathway to any kind of a deal that would bring Iran's energy to the markets. But the Russians need Iran's manufacturing. It produces a lot of consumer goods and other things that the Russian market needs in the short run. They are investing in building transportation hubs that will connect Russia to the Persian Gulf. And then there is this military relationship. So in the short run, the Russians need Iranian missiles and drones, the kind of weaponry that Iran had invested in building, but the Russians hadn't necessarily, because their military philosophy was very different. And the Russians are looking to give Iran serious military hardware, which is, Su-35, advanced fighter jets, S-400, maybe missiles, the technology transfer for Iran to build other weaponry. And once that happens, Iran will be integrated into Russian military sphere. Iran is not currently integrated into Russian military sphere, but it will. And so Russia's incentivized to push this process. And I think the Revolutionary Guards, as a military force, sees a great benefit in having that kind of a strategic partnership with Russia and get aircraft and missiles and other sets of things. Now, I have to emphasize, there was a time in Iran, there was a debate. There were people who would say there is a Europe, there is a United States. We need to stay neutral, and then there were those who would say no, we should forget about the West and focus on Russia. With the collapse of Iran-European relations, there is no more debate, because there's no relationship with Europe for some diplomats and people around the table to argue for. So there has been an acceleration, if you would, of this trend towards Russia.
would you say, could Russia go as far as to accepting a nuclear Iran, changing?
Well, the strategic issues before Russia are changing. Russia of today is not the Russia of 2 years ago. So, 2 years ago, I would say Russia does not want a nuclear Iran, does not want war in the Middle East, but does not want peace with the United States. With Russia's own back being to the wall, it's not about Iran. It's about what does it mean for Russia's ability to stay alive in the Ukraine war. And I think if right now their calculation has shifted. They had not contemplated giving Iran advanced jet fighters or missiles 2 years ago. Now they are. And as this relation deepens, I think the Russians may adopt a very different tact vis-a-vis a nuclear Iran.
Let's say you always anticipate, it's great. My next question with your previous answer, which is good because it helps us to connect topics. Because you mentioned what Russia doesn't want is peace in the Middle East for United States. And now, moving out of Iran a little bit, I could say that while most of us are concerned and worried and discussing the vertical escalation of the war in Ukraine, others stress the risk of horizontal escalation in the region. It has Russia fostering instabilities in countries in which it has a stake. Mm-hmm. Would you agree in that, in this second thought? And which country could be most affected in the Middle East, apart from Iran, which we mentioned?
Well, the sort of at the macro level, Russians would like to deflect all of Europe and America's pressure on themselves to somewhere else. So if there was a major crisis in the Middle East or in Asia, and Middle East is more of a candidate, it would force Europe and the United States to shift their focus away from Russia to the Middle East, and that's to the benefit of the Russians. If the United States has to calculate that it has to keep some of its weaponry, missiles, etc., for Middle East, then it would not have enough to give to Ukraine. So this is very simple calculation. But there is other things here too. For instance, Russians, the closer they get to Iran, the more they are worried about Israel damaging Iran's ability to support Russia, which is something Iran is calculating on. So there is a line after which, if Israel crosses with Iran, it's not about United States and Europe supporting Israel. It's about what kind of a reaction the Russians may give. Would they come back to Syria in a big way? Would they do something? Would they give Iran the kind of weaponry to defend itself against Israel, which they haven't given to it right now, like S-400 missiles, right? And that could raise tensions. The other side of this is that the Russians have right now an understanding with Saudi Arabia and UAE around OPEC plus and oil production. And the United States is putting a lot of pressure on these oil countries to pump a lot more oil in order to support and sustain the European cap. If these countries were to listen to the West, then the agreement they have with Russia will fall apart, and the Russians would be motivated to punish them. So there are others in this room in the Middle East. There are other conversations with Russia. There's other considerations that Iran's rivals have with Russia, which is not about Iran. It's about Russia itself. But Iran is in the middle of it, right? And that's one of the reasons why the Iranians are cozying up to Russia, because they want Russia to protect them against Israel and against Saudi Arabia. The more vital Iran becomes to Russia at this moment in time, the more incentivized Russia is to exercise some discipline on Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, it's an open question. How much leverage does Russia have with Israel or Saudi Arabia? But we're dealing with a picture in which Europe and the United States are not the only actors here.
And again, you anticipated my last question, because you have advised the senior American policymaker, including the President and the Secretary of State. Over the years, the role of the United States in the Middle East has changed significantly. The question is, how will the hot war in Ukraine and the Cold War with China further impact on the US posture in the region?
Well, it already has given the region a sense that the United States, even if it wanted to, cannot really fully commit militarily to the region. And we see the impact of that in the Abraham Accords, for instance, that countries in the Persian Gulf region are now relying on a much closer military intelligence relationship with Israel to compensate for the insecurity they feel from the United States. After the United States did not defend Saudi Arabia when Iran attacked its oil facilities, the Saudis also basically, and UAE, et cetera, decided that they're going to not follow the United States on Russia and China policy. So we've seen them not wanting to support Europe and Ukraine the way Europeans expected it, or that they recently had a big summit with the president of China. And they basically are trying to and also they started talking to Iran much more. Like, UAE and Kuwait sent back their ambassadors to Tehran. Saudi Arabia has had conversations with Iran, although they haven't gone very far. But this is a very different policy that the Iran's neighbors are following. And the reason they're following this is because they no longer are confident of the kind of American security guarantee that existed under President Bush, President Clinton, et cetera. They see the United States has gone back to great power rivalry with the two bigger powers, Russia and China. Middle East is important, but it's now been pushed down to priority number 3 in terms of geostrategy. And so the war in Ukraine is actually proof that the United States for the foreseeable future will be focused on Europe, on containing Russia rather than on containing Iran.
Well, it was, as usual, extremely interesting and inspiring. So I thank you very much, dear Vali, and I really hope to have you with us in person at MED, possibly in Rome, next edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Have a good day.